Welcome back, everybody, to freshcatholic.com and episode 2 of our Jubilee Year 2025 one-off. If you were with us in episode number 1, what I did in a kind of water skiing across the surface type fashion is I led us on kind of a journey through salvation history, a journey through the Bible, where we kind of traced the origins and roots of what we know as a Jubilee year. We established a Sabbath day, then we established a Sabbath year, then we established a Jubilee year, all in the Old Testament. And then we established how it was brought into the New Testament by Jesus in that sermon in the synagogue in Nazareth, and how we traced it further to the 1300 AD and Pope Boniface, where it has been part of Catholic tradition ever since, where originally every 50 years, now every 25 years, a Jubilee year is announced. We also dropped in the fact that the great Pope St. John Paul II, in a lot of ways, his entire pontificate was a Jubilee-type pontificate because he used Jubilee-type language. So we basically kind of traced the origin and the development, laid in some background, episode number 1. And in this episode, we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of this year's actual Jubilee year. And we're going to specifically talk about, as we've mentioned in episode number 1, the graces, the blessings, the mercy that are available in the Jubilee year. We're going to talk about what those are, how they're made available to us, how we can obtain them, and basically, how that all helps us in our journey towards eternal life. So this will be episode number 2. So let's start here. The graces, the blessings, the mercy that are flowing abundantly in a Jubilee year, okay? They are, how shall I say, in a Jubilee year, they're delivered to us in what's called an indulgence. Now, what is an indulgence? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, specifically paragraph 1471, and I'm going to read verbatim the definition of an indulgence that the Catechism of the Catholic Church gives us. It's going to be a mouthful, so I'll read it, and then I'll kind of separate it out into parts, and we'll kind of treat each part individually. So, the graces, the blessings, the mercy, all the good stuff that's flowing to us in a Jubilee year, it comes to us through what's called an indulgence. So what is an indulgence? An indulgence, this is what the Catechism says. An indulgence is a remission before God of the temporal punishment due to sins whose guilt has already been forgiven, which the faithful Christian who is duly disposed gains under certain prescribed conditions through the action of the Church, which, as the minister of redemption, dispenses and applies with authority the treasury of satisfactions of Christ and the saints. That is paragraph 1471, the Catechism's definition of an indulgence. And if, as I was reading it, you were kind of drinking out of a fire hose and your eyes started to glaze over and you're going, I've already lost the scent already, I've lost track of what this definition even is, let's see if we can take a couple of minutes and break this definition down into its parts so that mere mortals like you and I can understand it, right? So, and also there's 2 types of indulgences, the Catechism goes on to say, a plenary indulgence and a partial indulgence, which we'll get to in a minute. So, this whole deal of an indulgence, okay, which is what we can gain in a Jubilee year, which contains all these graces and mercy and blessings, okay? Let's see if we can kind of sneak up on what exactly this is, okay? Now, in order to do that, again, let's where should we start? Okay, now, when Christ went to the cross and he underwent his sacrifice, okay, the sacrifice of the cross, he gained and merited all the graces, an infinite number and value of graces, enough graces to cover all the sins of every human being that's ever been born, is born, or will be born from the beginning of time to the end of time, okay? Because he was God, his sacrifice merited an infinite amount of graces that had infinite value to cover everything. Now, those graces he merited on the cross, he basically deposited, if you will, if we use some layman's terms, he deposited all those graces he won on the cross. He deposited them in his church, okay? And through giving his first pope, Peter, the keys to the kingdom of binding and loosing, he gave his vicar on earth, his representative on earth, the Pope, the popes, he gave them the keys to this treasury. All right? So again, Christ goes to the cross, his sacrifice. He's God. His sacrifice merits an infinite amount and value of graces, enough to cover every sin of every person for all time. He deposits those graces, if you will, into the treasury of his church. And he gives his representative on earth, the vicar of Christ on earth, the Pope, the keys to that treasury. So he's given his church the ability to go into the treasury of graces that he won on the cross, that he deposited in his church. He's given his church the authority and the ability to open up that treasury and draw from it. And that's what the church does in a Jubilee year, okay? What Pope Francis, in essence, is done, okay, is he now, okay, has opened up that treasury of graces that Christ deposited into his church, and now the church can draw from it abundantly and distribute it to the faithful. So that's when the definition talks about that the church draws from the treasury of satisfactions, that's what we're talking about. Now, in addition to all the graces Christ won on the cross that are going into this treasury, that are deposited into his church, in addition to that, go all the good works of the Blessed Virgin Mary and all the good works of the saints. So, I mean, if we were to look at this in a very, very natural sense, you know, when you go into a bank, right, and you go into the vault, and you have to, you know, the vault has to get opened up, and you go into your safe deposit box, right? Well, you know, again, the church has this treasury, this safe deposit box, this vault, so to speak, right? That Christ and his sacrifice, along with the Blessed Virgin Mary's works and the saints' works, all these graces have been deposited into this treasury box that's in the church. And every 25 years or so, the Pope opens up this treasury and makes all those graces available. Okay? Now, let's go back to the definition. Okay? An indulgence is a remission before God of the temporal punishment due to sins whose guilt has already been forgiven. All right? Now, what is the definition talking about there? Well, now, if we go back, now, again, to the creation account, we were created, we are the crown jewel, mankind is the crown jewel of God's creation. One of the things that makes him the crown jewel is he's made in the image and likeness of God. And one of the ways we're in the image and likeness of God is we image God, we're like God, in that we have in a finite degree what he has in an infinite degree. We have an intellect, we have a free will, we have emotions. God has an intellect, God has a free will, God has emotions. We share in those. We image God, we're like God, in that we share in them in a very, very finite degree. Now, when we were created, our intellects were clear. We could see the good clearly. Our wills were strong. We could pursue the good easily. And our emotions were kept in check. Now, Adam and Eve commit original sin. Okay? And as a result, now our human nature is what's called fallen. And our fallen human nature, we still have our intellect. But now it's not clear, it's cloudy. We don't see the good as clearly as we should. Sometimes we see good as being evil, sometimes we see evil as being good. So our intellects have gone from clear to cloudy. Our wills have gone from strong to weak. So after original sin, we don't see the good as clearly as we used to, okay? We don't pursue it as easily as we used to. And our emotions now, they're hard to keep in check. They've got kind of minds of their own. They're unbridled. All of that is part and parcel of our fallen human nature, which was a result of original sin, okay? So because our intellects are cloudy, because our wills are weak, because our emotions are unbridled, we have a tendency to sin. And thus we do just that. We sin. Now, fortunately, okay, when we're baptized, okay, original sin was taken away, but we were still left with our fallen human nature. We were still left with that cloudy intellect, that weak will, and those unbridled emotions. We're still left with the tendency, the inclination to sin. And thus we do. Fortunately, God gave us another sacrament, post-baptism, the sacrament of reconciliation. So when we do give in to our fallen human natures, and we do sin, we can go to confession and we can have that sin forgiven. Okay? Now, when we go to confession and we have that sin forgiven, the guilt of that sin is removed, but the punishment due to that sin remains. And we have to work off that punishment either here in this life or in purgatory. Because again, the life, in order to enter and live the life of heaven, our souls have to be pristine, okay? We have to be full of sanctifying grace. No mortal sin. No venial sin. And any punishment that we've acquired due to our sins has to be completely worked off. Our souls have to be pristine. okay, to enter and live the life of heaven. So when we go to confession, yes, the guilt of the sin is removed, but the punishment due to that sin still has to be worked off. Now, if you're saying, well, wait a second, if God removes the guilt of the sin, okay, why doesn't he just remove the punishment? He could, he's God. Why does he remove the guilt of the sin but leave us the job, so to speak, of working off the punishment due to sin? Okay? And even before that, why is there any punishment due to sin? Let's take a look at that one first, okay? So the sin is forgiven, but the punishment remains. I still have to work it off. Why is that the case? Well, let's go to one of my favorite analogies on the natural level, okay? And we've used this before in a couple of previous series. Let's say that I throw a brick through your window. I deliberately walk up to your front window and I deliberately throw a brick through it, shattering it, all right? I come back the next day. You know, I have a kind of an attack of, you didn't see me do this, right? So I come back the next day, I've had a little attack of conscience, right? And I come up to you and I say, look, you know, I was the one that threw the brick through your window. Will you forgive me? And you say, yes, you're forgiven. That's basically what happens in the confessional. We sin, we walk into the confessional, we confess our sin, we ask God for forgiveness. God, through his priest, grants us that forgiveness. Okay? And we walk out of the confessional. Well, now let's go back to the natural example. I've come up to you. I've said, look, I got a confession to make. I was the one that threw the brick through your window. Will you forgive me? You say you're forgiven. All right? And then I leave your front doorstep. Well, wait a second. Yes, you've forgiven me for breaking your window. But the fact still remains, the window is still broken. I have to make you whole, okay? And I either have to fix the window itself or I have to pay for the window to get fixed, you know? Because it's great you've forgiven me, but the fact remains you still have a broken window. And I still have the responsibility, the obligation to make sure it's fixed, to make you whole, okay? Well, when we sin, yes, in confession, the sin is forgiven, okay? But I've still offended and insulted and done damage, okay? I still have to have punishment for that sin, all right? Just like my punishment for breaking your window, even though you've forgiven me, my punishment is I got to spend 10 hours of my own time fixing it, or I have to pay somebody else to fix it, right? Well, for sinning against God, I've got punishment that has to be worked off, okay? And again, all the sins that I commit, if all of them are forgiven, all of those sins have punishment attached to them, all right? And if I'm smart, I will do the things that work off that punishment as much as possible in this life, because I can't enter heaven until all that punishment is worked off, okay? Now, what are some of the ways that I can work off punishment in this life? Well, the penance the priest gives me in the confessional, that's where it starts. I do my prescribed penance. That is given to me for the express purpose of working off this punishment, okay? I can also do all kinds of other things. I can perform the corporal works of mercy. I can perform the spiritual works of mercy. Any number of things I can do in this life to work off the punishment that's due to my sins, even though they've been forgiven. All right? So now, you know, if you think of all the sins you've committed your entire life, even if they've all been forgiven, they all have a certain amount of punishment still to be worked off. Okay? And if you total up all that punishment, okay, depending on how many sins you've committed and how maybe little punishment you've worked off so far, you could be sitting here with a lot of punishment still to be worked off for those sins. Okay? Now, this is where a Jubilee year comes in. Because if I can gain an indulgence during the Jubilee year, okay, then a tremendous amount of that punishment can be worked off through the indulgence I gain in a Jubilee year. Okay? Now, let's go a little further forward. We mentioned there are two types of indulgences, a plenary indulgence and a partial indulgence. If I can gain a plenary indulgence, what that means is that all of the punishment due to all of my sins that I still have to work off, that plenary indulgence will work off all of it. My slate will be completely clean. Unbelievable. A partial indulgence is some of the temporal punishment that I owe to my sins is worked off, but not all of them. So that's why we say a Jubilee year is so significant. Because if I can gain a Jubilee year indulgence, okay, that is in one setting, in one fell swoop, that is the best way for me to clear all the punishment that I still owe due to my forgiven sins off of my soul. There's no better, more effective way for me to do that than through a Jubilee year indulgence. If I can get a Jubilee year plenary indulgence, then all of the punishment is worked off. I'm a completely clean slate. Okay? If I can get a partial Jubilee year indulgence, then a lot of it is worked off. All right? But what we're saying here is there is no better way and no better time to deal with the punishment you have to work off to sins that have been forgiven than by gaining a Jubilee year indulgence. Okay? That's big time. Now, let's take a look at both of those indulgences. All right? The plenary indulgence and the partial indulgence. Now, let's go back to the definition the Catechism gives us, is that we can gain an indulgence by doing certain prescribed acts, okay, which if we do them, will take away some of that punishment due to our sin. Now, there's two types of indulgences, the plenary and the partial. So now, I'm thinking to myself, okay, Charles, it's the Jubilee year. I want to gain a Jubilee year indulgence. There's two types, plenary and partial. If I can gain a Jubilee year plenary indulgence, all of the punishment that I have to work off before I can go to heaven, that Jubilee year plenary indulgence will work off all of it. I will be a completely clean slate. All right? That's the kind of indulgence I want to go for. You know, I want, my sins have been forgiven. And now through this plenary indulgence, all the punishment to those sins has been worked off. My soul is completely clean. So I want to gain a Jubilee year plenary indulgence. How do I do that? Well, there are 6 prescribed conditions that I've got to meet. And I've got to go 6 for 6. All right? If I go 6 for 6, I've gained this plenary indulgence, all of the punishment due to my sins completely gone. If I fall a little short and I do 5 of the 6, then I don't get the plenary indulgence. It defaults, if you will, to a partial indulgence, where some of the punishment due to my sins is taken away, okay, but not all of it. So what do I have to do to technically gain this plenary indulgence and have all my punishment taken away? First of all, I have to be in a state of grace, okay? First thing I got to do. So if I say, okay, tomorrow I am going to set out to gain this plenary indulgence, what's the first thing I got to do? I got to be in a state of grace, which means I have to go to confession. All right? I can't have any unconfessed mortal sin on my soul. So condition number 1, be in a state of grace, go to confession. Second, I have to receive Holy Communion. Now, most fittingly, most appropriately, I receive Holy Communion as part of participating in Mass. But it doesn't have to be that way. I can just receive Holy Communion. All right? Next, while I'm in a state of grace and after I've received Holy Communion, I want to pray for the Pope's intentions. So I look up what the Pope's intentions happen to be, and I pray the standard Our Father, Hail Mary, and Glory be for the Pope's intentions. And you can find them on the Vatican website. You can find them on the internet. Okay. Next, I have to perform an indulged act. Now, what is an indulged act? Well, an indulged act could be any number of things. I could do the Stations of the Cross. I could pray the Rosary. I could spend a holy hour in adoration before the Blessed Sacrament. I could perform the a corporal work of mercy. I could perform a spiritual work of mercy. I could read Scripture. Okay. I can do an act of penance where I basically choose to give up something. Okay. So again, let's review. Tomorrow, I want to go after that Jubilee year plenary indulgence, where all my punishment due to my sins is taken away, where my slate is clean. All right? Got to go to confession. Got to be in a state of grace. Got to receive Holy Communion. All right? Got to pray an Our Father, a Hail Mary, and a Glory be for the Pope's intentions. I got to do an indulged act. Stations, Rosary, adoration, corporal work of mercy, spiritual work of mercy, reading or listening to Scripture. Okay? And then the last one. I have to have an interior disposition of complete detachment from all sin. Let me repeat that. I have to have an interior disposition where I have complete detachment from all sin. Complete detachment from all sin. All right? That is of the conditions that a plenary indulgence requires. That is, for most everybody, the sticking point. Okay? Because to be practical, okay, to have your soul, to have your interior disposition completely detached from all sin, thoughts of sin, desires of sin, that is nearly impossible, okay? It is very, very, very difficult. Going to confession, I can do that. Receiving Holy Communion, I can do that. Praying for the Pope's intentions, I can do that. Performing an indulged act, I can do that. I can do the Stations, I can do the Rosary, I can do a corporal works of mercy, I can do a spiritual work of mercy, I can do adoration. All of those conditions I can do. but to have me interiorly completely free, detached from all sin and all desire for sin, that is well nigh, you might say, impossible. And that last condition is what makes the plenary indulgence, practically speaking, so difficult. Because on the one level, it sounds great. If I can gain this plenary indulgence, all the punishment due to all the sins I've committed that have been piling up is all gone. Okay? It sounds almost too good to be true, right? It sounds fantastic. All right? Well, what do I got to do that? Go to confession. All right, no problem. Receive Holy Communion. No problem. Pray for the Pope's intentions. No problem. Perform an indulged act. No problem. Until I get to that last one. Be interiorly disposed of complete attachment for all sin and all desire for sin. Just about impossible. Okay? That's why the plenary indulgence, as unbelievable as it is, practically speaking, if we're going to be honest here, very, very difficult to obtain. Okay? Well, suppose I can do all those other things. Confession, Holy Communion, Pope's intentions, indulged act, right? And I fall short of that last one. Okay? So I don't get the plenary indulgence. All of the punishment due to my sins is not taken away in one fell swoop, right? Does that mean I don't get any indulgence at all? No. Failure to gain the plenary indulgence, okay, I'll default down to a partial indulgence, okay? So it's not an either-or situation. I can shoot for the plenary indulgence, which I certainly should. But knowing practically and be honest about it, how difficult it is to obtain, all right, if I don't get there, right, then I default down, so to speak, to a partial indulgence where still some of the punishment due to my sins is taken away. Okay, not all of it, but some of it. And some is better than none. Okay, now how much of the sum, how much punishment is taken away in a partial indulgence, I don't know. That's on God. But what I do know is if I shoot for the plenary indulgence, so to speak, and I fall short and default down to a partial indulgence, I know that through that indulgence, a certain amount of the punishment I have to work off before I go to heaven has been worked off. How much, I don't know. But I know some of it has been worked off. Okay? And I can go after these indulgences. It's not like all year long. Okay? I can try and obtain a plenary indulgence or a partial indulgence every single day, every single week during this Jubilee year. So that's why we say if you're looking to work off punishment due to the sins that have been forgiven, which we have to work off before we die, right? Otherwise, we're going to have to do it in purgatory, okay? If I'm looking for the best way to do that, a Jubilee year indulgence is that best way, okay? And there's no maxing out of how many indulgences I can obtain, okay? Now, let's go back and let's look at a little bit more of the fine print, so to speak. Going to confession, receiving Holy Communion, praying for the Pope's intentions. Those three things, okay, and doing the indulged act, let's add that in. So confession, Holy Communion, pray for the Pope's intentions, do the indulged act, okay? Ideally, all of those things should be done on the same day. Ideally. So ideally, I should wake up tomorrow morning, go to confession, receive Holy Communion, pray for the Pope's intention, and that same day do an indulged act. Stations, rosary, the ones that we listed. Okay, do all of those the same day, ideally. Okay, but it's not a requirement. Okay, those things can be done 20 days before or after the indulged act. Okay, so let's say today I go to confession. I receive Holy Communion. I pray for the Pope's intentions. But I don't do the indulged act today. Okay, I don't do it till tomorrow or next week. Okay, all of these things, these four things, ideally done in the same day, but they all have to be done within a 20-day block. Okay, so we want to mention that as well. Now, I know this is a lot of stuff, which is another reason why we spread it out over 2 episodes, because I know that a lot of Catholics, they've never heard of indulgences, they never heard of a Jubilee year, or maybe they've heard of indulgences, but they're not quite sure what they are or how they work or how they're obtained, that sort of thing. So again, this is certainly not exhaustive. And hopefully our heads aren't spinning and we're not drinking out of too much of a fire hose. And hopefully I'm halfway explaining this understandably. All right. But hopefully you can see how significant and tremendous this Jubilee year of 2025 is. Okay. Because when Pope Francis had that holy door unsealed, okay, and walked through the threshold, all right, and declared from that point on 2025 being a Jubilee year, all right, he is kind of throwing open wide those treasury of graces that Christ won on the cross, okay? They're available in a Jubilee year like never before, okay? We appropriate them, we gain them through gaining an indulgence. And there's 2 types of indulgences, the plenary and the partial. The plenary takes away all the punishment due to sin. The partial takes away some of it. But there are certain prescribed conditions, okay? Again, for the plenary, confession, Holy Communion, pray for the Pope's intentions, do an indulged act, and that last one, be interiorly disposed, all detachment from sin and the desire for sin. Very, very difficult, to be honest. So plenary indulgences, very difficult to obtain. However, if we can't obtain them and we do the other things, we gain a partial indulgence where we're assured that a certain amount of the punishment that we owe, that needs to be worked off, is taken away. Okay? Now, the other thing that is recommended during a Jubilee year is that we make a pilgrimage. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean it has to be to Vatican, it doesn't have to be to one of those 4 basilicas. We don't have to go to St. Peter's Basilica. Okay? Typically, each archdiocese, each region designates a church as the pilgrim church for a Jubilee year. So you can look up your particular archdiocese, your particular region, see which church was designated the Jubilee year pilgrimage church, and you can make a pilgrimage to that local church and walk through the front door of that church, walk through the holy door of that church, okay? That's also recommended that we do during a Jubilee year, all right? If we want to enter into this as fruitfully and as completely as possible. Now, once we gain an indulgence, the next thing we should talk about is, number 1, I gain an indulgence, right? a certain amount of punishment due to sin is now eligible to be taken away? Well, first and foremost, I want to gain the indulgence for myself, my own soul. Okay? Now, I can also have that indulgence. In addition to having that indulgence applied to my own soul, I can also have it applied to the soul of a deceased person. So if one of my friends or family members, their soul is in purgatory, and their leftover temporal punishment due to sins, the ones that they didn't work off in their lifetime, that is now being worked off in purgatory, okay, I can take the indulgence I gain and apply it to them. And that will help speed their time through purgatory. So once I gain an indulgence, I can apply it to my own soul, work off my own punishment. I can apply it to a deceased soul in purgatory to help work off their punishment, all right? I cannot apply it to another living person. So I can't gain an indulgence and the amount of punishment that that indulgence will work off. And I can't apply it to Simon, okay? Simon's got to work off his own punishment, all right? So I can apply it to myself. I can apply it to a deceased person, a soul in purgatory. I cannot have it applied to another living soul, okay? If they want to work off punishment on their souls, then they have to gain their own indulgence. So we should say that as well, okay? Now, let's say, let's say a couple more things here. I'm looking through notes because I want to make sure that I mention everything. Now, typically a Jubilee year always has its own theme. And the theme for this Jubilee year is Pilgrims of Hope. And the reason Pope Francis chose that is because in his estimation, in his view, one of the things people are losing is hope. One of the things people are seeking is hope. Because of everything that's been going on, right? So that's why he designated this Jubilee year with the theme Pilgrims of Hope. And he issued a letter, and it's called the Decree on the Jubilee Indulgence. And he mentions a couple of, when we talk about gaining an indulgence, part of it, in addition to confession and communion and praying for the Pope's intentions, is doing an indulged act, all right? I want to point out a couple of indulged acts that Pope Francis particularly singled out in this particular degree, okay? One of them was to have your indulged act be one of the corporal works of mercy. And I'm going to read the quote in this decree that he mentions that. This is Pope Francis's words. In a special way during the Holy Year, we are called to be tangible signs of hope for those of our brothers and sisters who experience hardships of any kind. More especially, one should rediscover the corporal works of mercy. In this way, the faithful will be able to obtain the Jubilee indulgence if they visit for an appropriate amount of time their brothers and sisters who are in need or in difficulty, the sick, prisoners, lonely elderly people, disabled people. By visiting their brothers and sisters in need or difficulty, in a sense, they are making a pilgrimage to Christ in them. Okay? In addition to the spiritual, sacramental, and prayerful conditions, which is confession, communion, and praying for the Pope's intentions. The faithful can repeat the visits throughout the Holy Year, even daily, acquiring an indulgence each time. So if you're looking for those prescribed conditions, and one of them being an indulged act, and you're going, okay, well, what indulged act do I want to choose? The Stations, Rosary, whatever, okay? Pope Francis here is saying, a good thing is let's use this Jubilee year to rediscover the corporal works of mercy, okay? To be present to our brothers and sisters in need or in difficulty, okay? And in that way, by making a pilgrimage to them, whether it's in the nursing home, if they're homebound or whatever, in making a pilgrimage to them, we're making a pilgrimage to Christ in them, okay? And that would be a way of being a sign of hope for these people. So if you're looking for an indulged act every time you want to try and obtain one of these Jubilee year indulgences, Pope Francis says one of the better ones, I mean, they're all good, obviously, Stations, Rosary, but they said, use this as a time to rediscover the corporal works of mercy, okay? Maybe consider that to be your indulged act every time you try and obtain an indulgence, okay? Now, he goes on to mention something else, okay? He says, and we listed it in our conditions, that an indulged act can also be an act of penance. Yes, Rosary, Stations, corporal work of mercy, spiritual work of mercy, but also an act of penance. And Pope Francis kind of singles this one out as well, okay? Listen to what he says about having your indulged act be an act of penance. This is what he says. The Jubilee indulgence can also be obtained through initiatives that put into practice in a concrete and general way the spirit of penance, which is, in a sense, the soul of the Jubilee. In particular, this would be a great time, again, to rediscover, okay, the nature of Friday through abstaining in a spirit of penance, at least for one day of the week, from what he calls futile distractions, use of social media, superfluous consumption, and by fasting, by donating an appropriate amount of money to the poor, by supporting the works of religious and social nature. So he says another thing that we can use the Jubilee year for, if we're trying to determine an appropriate indulged act, is not only to rediscover the corporal works of mercy, but to rediscover the traditional Friday acts of penance, where, on Fridays, we abstain, we fast a little bit. That would be a good way that we can perform the indulged act, an act of kind of penance for ourselves. Okay, so I guess in the final analysis, what I'm hoping I've achieved here in this 2-episode one-off is, number one, establishing that this Jubilee year is biblically based, and then moving into this episode, establishing the fact that there's never a better time where the doors of Christ's mercy are thrown open and graces are available than during a Jubilee year. And we can lay hold of those graces through gaining an indulgence. And we've talked about what an indulgence is, what it takes away, the punishment due to our sins, and the two types of them, plenary and partial, and the conditions for both, okay? And the ability to do this began Christmas Eve of last year and will continue all the way through 2025 up to the Feast of the Epiphany 2026, where the Jubilee year will officially end. So again, hopefully I've been clear. Hopefully this has given us maybe some awareness and understanding of that momentous, significant event that Pope Francis did, while many of us weren't even noticing, back on Christmas Eve 2024. So with that, Thank you again for supporting Fresh Catholic. Thank you for supporting this 2-episode one-off. I pray that my explanations were understandable and that we all gain as many of these Jubilee indulgences as possible, and we work off as much of that punishment due to sin as we possibly can, because there's no better time than during a Jubilee year, and this opportunity is not going to come around for possibly another 25 years or so. So with that, take care. God bless. I'm Charles Merritt.